Okay, welcome to part two of macroeconomic theory and policy. So now we will go ahead and talk about what are the latest developments in economic thinking. What I want to bring to your attention is the fact that any field doesn't remain static, but it rather remains dynamic. In other words, nothing remains constant. Things keeps changing. All right. So even now in the economic thinking or macroeconomic policy and theory and policy, um, definitely there has been an evolution, in terms of school of thoughts or schools of thought. We can start with the initial one, which is we can start with the Keynesian or the Keynesianism, okay, which actually took over, especially in the first half of the 20th century, and particularly after the Great Depression. The Great Depression was from 1929 to 1930, around there. So after that period, the Keynesian took over. Of course, during the 1950s, things changed. We again had a situation whereby unemployment became the talk of around the world. And obviously, this has been celebrated by even some of the well-known economists or the so-called Phillips Curve, whereby this curve looks at the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And this trade-off was basically that the two variables do move in the opposite direction, such that um, in the presence of low inflation, you are likely to have high unemployment. And it was a celebrated theoretical hypothetical proposition or hypothesis, not hypothesis, a hypothesis in the 1950s. Of course, again, as time went by, we also had a situation of where the monetary or the monetarist took over, and we actually know that we had or there is this well-known economist Milton Friedman, who basically who actually led this monetarist approach to economic thinking. We can talk about theories of such as the quantity theory of money, which speaks about the relationship between money supply and price, or money supply and prices. Um, but of course, the monetarism became unpopular in the 70s because, again, as we said, there's always change. Oil price shocks took over. So, in the 1970s, OPEC, which is the uh, uh, basically which constitutes countries that produces oil. So now, because of these consecutive oil price shocks, so the approach to monetarism became less popular. Um, and then, of course, it was about now these price shocks. And then, of course, we have new classical and new Keynesian models that again followed. And then, obviously, now we are talking about the reemergence of the Keynesianism. Of course, they are looking at, or they're rather using a different approach as opposed to what they had looked at earlier. And then, of course, now we also have a combination of Keynesianism and monetarism, um, into feeding into how we look at economic thoughts, or how do we think about economics as the field keeps evolving. Of course, this evolution is brought about the different events that are taking place in nowadays, and so therefore we should actually know that as time goes by, we will have a genesis um, of different school of thoughts that actually speaks to the events or the economic events that is taking place at the time. Of course, some of them will, some of the old school of thoughts will remain partially applicable to what might happen now and maybe might not fall. Some of them obviously will become obsolete time and a time again, but um, some of them will be modified or find a different approach to whatever the economic problem might be there. And so therefore, the economic thinking keeps changing and changing depending on what is happening at the time. Now, why do we have to consider economic thinking? Or, why do we have to look at the history of economic thought? Um, because this helps us to understand how economies develop, or what transpired, or what led to the different stages of economic development, and what events took place, what type of thinking went around in molding and shaping the economic development of the economies, right? Of course, we know that in order for us to understand the history of economic thought, we also have to take into account the context. And this context involves political decisions by political leaders. We also have to take into account global events, because we know that domestic economies are not only affected by events that are happening within the economy, but they are also affected by events that are happening outside. Okay, if, say, for example, there is a shock in oil prices, or a change in oil prices, that definitely will affect economic events in South Africa. Um, I think even of recent, I think a few days ago, you might have been aware that in the US, the oil price actually went down to negative, such that producers now actually have to pay. They have to pay um, the buyers, because they don't have storage capacity for. So they have to pay the buyers to take. So suppliers have to pay the buyers to take oil, because they don't have storage capacity. So such things are unheard of, and these are things that will go down into history, in terms of, we have to think of economic policies now that will surround issues of oil, and as to how to deal with it in the near future should it happen again. Okay, because oil was considered as a commodity that is untouchable. But when you hear something like this, you get to you start to think as to what is going on. So therefore, all these events will definitely affect the domestic economy. If something happens in markets outside South Africa, we have to be worried, because we do trade with them, we do make transactions with them, we do have investments denominated in currencies that are outside. And so these things do affect our currencies as well, do affect our local economy. And so, therefore, for that reason, it shapes the economic thinking of how we should go about things. In other words, the economic thinking is not just limited to events that are happening within the domestic economy, but also events that are happening um, outside shapes the economic thinking. And sometimes that's why you find that sometimes you have a situation whereby the economic thinking is universally applicable, because of the events that happened, is it's worldwide, or it's similar from country to country. All right. And so that is why there is always conversation or discussion among school of thoughts. And it is for this reason that if you ask um, same question to 20 economists, you'll probably get 30 answers, because there is always a reemergence of new ways of thinking, or new ways of dealing with problems that arises due to situations, or due to economic problems where we find ourselves in. All right, so that was the last slide regarding macroeconomic policy. And so I just put down two questions here just for you to sort of think, you know. For example, I mean, we spoke about lags. So why do you think, for example, recognition lag is important in economic policy? So first of all, you need to understand the concept of that recognition lag. If you understand it, then you'll be able to um, provide an explanation that, of course, it is important, because that we have data that we can or data that we can comprehend, and such that one can then really take recognition of what the exact problem is. And once you understand and you know what the problem is, you will then be in a position to take appropriate action in terms of counteracting that problem. So this is how, you need that logic in answering that question, and it's not just an issue of um, giving us what you know giving us back what we have given you. And then, of course, the second question is more on what is currently happening, and it relates to both monetary and fiscal policy. And basically, here I just asked if you consider a coronavirus as an economic problem. Then I went on to be very specific as to why do you think it requires both fiscal and monetary policy action. And of course, you have to, as I explained in my discussion, that you have to look at it from the viewpoint that it affects both the supply and demand side. And the story goes on as to how it affects the demand side and how it affects the supply side, and hence why do we need both fiscal and monetary policy in terms of addressing the problem. And of course, I didn't complete the answer here in terms of um, uh, 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 um, policy, but of course, you can understand that um, from the production side or even from the supply side, obviously, we can talk about government intervention in terms of what they are currently doing in terms of all these stimulus packages that are targeted to both small and medium enterprises, as well as um, individuals, households, in terms of social grants, in terms of um, um, you know uh, addressing these problems that are created by the coronavirus, and also to sort of, and you can see from the central bank point of view, repo rate was decreased, as I indicated earlier, so that we can have credit availability and so forth and so on. So when you're answering questions, try to understand the question and its applicability to the real world, because this is what you will be doing as not only as an economist or as an economic student, but even or for as long as you are from the commerce world, you need to understand the applicability of what you are doing. So, and therefore, you must be in a position to use the knowledge that you have acquired to address and try to understand the real world problem, and use to see how you can go around solving them or contributing to alleviating such problems.